Welcome to another video. We are once again honored to have on our channel Louis from the Magisterium Levi channel. With Western religious holidays approaching, we'll briefly discuss the nativity scene. How many videos have you seen of someone very knowledgeable about the subject talking to you about the nativity scene and what it's about? Where did this idea originate? What does it mean? How was it created and how is it understood? We'll discuss all of this. Welcome. Shalom.
Shalom, Jacob. So today we're going to bring up a topic. Jacob asked me, do you have any interesting topic for Christmas? And I said, well, why don't we talk about the origin of the animals that appear in the manger? Here I have it. I'm going to show it to you to see if it shows up on the screen. I have here a manger, a little nativity scene from when I was in Peru, in Arequipa. And here we have two little animals. Let's talk about the origin of these two animals, which are the donkey, or in some places the mule, and the ox. We're going to talk about both of them, so let's look at the origin of these two animals. Why are they shown in the Nativity or Bethlehem if they're not in the New Testament? What is their origin if they're not mentioned there? So, as always, I've brought a document, a paper, a PDF, because that's already a tradition on the channel, so you can follow along little by little. And we're going to look at it from the New Testament, from the beginning. There we have the transition. I've titled it From Prophecy to Iconography, mainly because, well, it's a nativity scene, and that's why iconography, because it's a nativity scene, obviously. The ox and the donkey in the manger. So first, we have their absence in the biblical canon. This is the starting point. That is, research into the presence of the ox and the donkey must begin by noting their absence in the texts. That is, neither the ox nor the donkey appear in the New Testament. In the Gospel of Luke, we have an account of the nativity. It simply mentions the birthplace and humble bed of the child. She gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. This is in Luke 2:7. In the Gospel of Matthew, there is no manger. Does it instead focus on Jose de la Vista, the wise men or astrologers? Without mentioning details about the animal stable, in other words, for now there are no animals, we only have Luke. The manger appears and that's it. We have nothing else. So where does all of this come from? Well, it's going to come from the Septuagint. You're going to see a very interesting journey, which is everything starts with the Septuagint, the Greek Bible. The Christian tradition is going to be nourished by an exegetical reading of two Old Testament passages translated in the Septuagint, which were interpreted by the Church Fathers as prophecies fulfilled in the Nativity. This is page 141 from Fernandez Marcos's book, the one from the Spanish National Research Council, the Spanish National Research Council. Today we'll discuss the fourth volume, Prophetic Books, covering Isaiah and Habakkuk. And on the screen you have two quotes, one with a part in Greek and another part in Hebrew, which is Isaiah 1:3, that is the central passage. Isaiah's prophetic complaint contrasts animals' faithfulness with people's ignorance. So we have the quote from the Septuagint, we have it in Hebrew. It says, "Does the ox know its owner and the donkey the manger of its master? Israel does not know me, my people do not have perfect understanding." That's literally in Hebrew. Why is it not like that in Greek? Has it been modified? So, if we go to this page from Natalia Fernandez Marcos's book and read it in Greek, does it say, "Does the ox know its owner?" It's the same here. "The donkey knows its master's manger, but Israel hasn't known me. My people haven't come to their senses." So how was this interpreted? How did I show it on the screen? Bold. The ox knew its owner, and the donkey knew its master's manger. Israel and my people did not understand in the past. So are they now going to interpret the Christian patristics or this text from the past? You mean as a unique past event, not a timeless one? That's why I wrote new, but the text says knows, even though it's referring to the past. It's the next section about Israel. I highlighted it because my people didn't understand. They see it as a unique event. It's a difference between Hebrew and Greek. That is, this is Christian patristics, reinterpreting the text of the Jinta sect, not from Hebrew. So, the verbal form in Hebrew is seen by scholars as a static perfect, expressing a timeless truth. It's a fact that the ox knows its owner. This is evident, right, at any time? No, it's a unique and special event. However, the aorist ethnos suggests a completed action in the past for the Church Fathers. This made it easier to interpret the prophecy as a reference to a specific past event, that is, a unique one. Namely, the moment when Jesus was placed in the manger and the animals in fact recognized him, knew him. Therefore, the Greek version of the text, with its focus on past knowledge, it becomes the primary source for linking the prophecy of Isaiah directly to the historical scene of the Nativity, as if it were a complete prophecy. At the very same moment, the birth of Christ, that is the theological meaning, here we have Christian patristics. He interpreted the ox as a symbol of the people under the law, and the donkey as a symbol of the Gentiles or humanity, both instinctively recognizing Christ, the master who is already making his manger. This is Justin Martyr in the dialogue with Trypho. That is to say, here we already have that the patristics are interpreting this as a symbol of the Jewish people and the donkey as a symbol of the Gentiles. Both Jew and Gentile, all humanity, recognize Christ, the master who now makes his manger. However, we see that these animals are symbolic, that is, they represent the Gentiles and the Jews. They aren't physical animals, but we'll see how they'll appear as such and recognize Jesus. I'm not sure if you want us to keep going with Habakkuk or take a break.
No, actually, that's exactly right. It's also a bit of common sense, I think, and even more than that. In fact, I was looking at this same verse as it appears in, let's say, Qumran text, because you know that in Qumran they found the entire scroll of Isaiah almost in perfect condition. And this specific verse is there, and it's also in the conjugation as we see it. So even though it's a bit faded, but basically, yes.
By the way, the bold words we've used are the animals. That is, Esor and Jamor are the ones we've put in bold there. That is, Jamor is the donkey. That is, Jamor and Sor. We've put them in bold so you know the animals. That is, the ox and the donkey, so you know. That's why we've made it easier. But the summary is simple. This is timeless. That is, the animals recognize their owners. That's simply what the text says. However, we see that in Greek, it is going to be seen as a specific fact, a unique event that already happened. That is a kind of prophecy, which is why it's reinterpreted as fulfilled in Jesus. And now we have more than just the one from Isaiah. Now we have Habakkuk, which is a little further down. Let's see if it picks up Habakkuk there. Perfect. Here, this changes completely. Here, we are not talking about a present or something timeless and a past. Here, we are talking about two animals appearing, while elsewhere they are unrelated. We have the Habakkuk quote, another prophecy common in liturgy and the Christian homeland, and the idea of animals flanking the Messiah. So here the text appears in Greek and we have it in Hebrew. Well, let's read it first in Greek because it's very curious. It tells us, prayer of Habakkuk the prophet with a song. Lord, I heard your announcement and was afraid. I saw your works and was shaken between two living beings. Will you be known? Well, okay, perfect. In Hebrew, O Lord, I have heard of your fame and I was afraid. O Lord, revive your work in these years. Make it known. In your wrath, remember mercy. Years can also mean times. So in the midst of the times, make it known. It doesn't have to be years. Well, there's something very clear here, and it's that it says in the midst of two living beings, they don't have to be animals. But Yaakov, what does Hebrew have to do with in the midst of the years, in the midst of the times, or in the midst of two living beings? The difference is significant. That's why we have a journey that we see, that with the passage of time from the Hebrew, from in the midst of the years or of the times, to it being living beings, and from living beings to animals. This is the change over time. That is quite an extensive change. I mean, and then we have the translation down here. We've used within the years or in the midst of the years to mean in the course of time. It can also be translated as time or in the midst of two living beings. The Septuagint misinterpreted or creatively translated the word shanim, that is years, as if it meant shum, that is living beings or animals, possibly due to a copying error. So, is the original Hebrew, the Hebrew text, a request to the Lord to manifest or make his work known? During these years, decree shanim, praying for God to act soon in human history. In the Greek translation, the translator interpreted the Hebrew word shanim, years, as shom, meaning living beings or animals. That is to say, we see a change. I think it's quite abrupt. Well, I have here the interpretation that comes afterwards, and the interpretation is clear. Depicting two living beings or animals was seen as a direct reference. Is the following one, the one below, there, which was understood as a direct reference to the ox and the donkey surrounding the manger, and this formula was quickly integrated into Christian iconography. Isaiah tells us there's an ox and a donkey. Here, instead of mentioning years, they refer to living beings, which will later be called animals. So if we have an ox and we have a donkey, it's a unique event where they recognize the Lord. And here we have them standing with two living beings. So of course, obviously you connect one with the other, and then you start having what we now know as a nativity scene. And now we have the finishing touch to all this, which is apocryphal texts. A pseudo-Matthew will emerge to clearly explain and connect these prophecies, putting everything into context. That is to say, the tradition, once established by the exegesis of the Christian fathers, is crystallized narratively in the apocryphal Gospels, that is in Pseudo-Matthew, 6th century AD. This Gospel, compiled from earlier texts, combines King Trato's birth prophecies, referencing the third day, when Mary placed the child in a manger and the ox and donkey worshipped him, fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy. You are the Pseudo-Matthew 14:1, and the text also quotes Habakkuk and Medio duoro animalium in osteceris, all found in the Pseudo-Matthew. It offers the narrative basis that iconography would adopt, giving animals an active role, time span, and warmth. And below, the entire literal text has been brought so that no one can say, hey, I don't know about this or that. Here it is, chapter 14. On the third day after the birth of the Lord, Maria left the grotto and entered a stable, placing the child in the manger, and the ox and the donkey worshipped him, thus fulfilling what the prophet Isaiah had announced. What we have just seen, the ox has recognized its owner, and the donkey, the manger of its Lord, it has recognized. Pay attention to the Greek, because in Hebrew it says knows, has known. See how it's interpreted in the past tense? That's why we used knows at the beginning, and now we have point 2. And these same animals that had the child among them worshipped him, or kept worshipping him without ceasing. Thus, what was spoken by the prophet Habakkuk was fulfilled. Or what we just saw, will you reveal yourself among 2 animals? And Joseph and Mary stayed in this place with the child for 3 days. By the way, if anyone besides all this wants an academic reference, for example, that we haven't prepared, here it is. On page 87 of the book by Natalia Fernandez Marcos and the Centro Superior de Información de la Defensa Center for Advanced Scientific Research, which I don't have with me, so I made this to read. What does it say about this? In Habakkuk's Epiphany, the divinity appears between 2 beings. The image was developed by the Christian tradition in relation to the episode of the Nativity of Jesus, where the child is accompanied in the manger by an ox and a donkey. The apocryphal Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew 14 cites the verse, attributing it to Habakkuk, and in the midst of 2 animals you will be known. That is the same thing we have read, so it's already perfect. So now we have the whole origin of the manger. We've already seen that it comes from the Septuagint of Habakkuk and Isaiah, and then from Pseudo-Matthew. Now I've brought you a curiosity, since we're talking about these topics. Well, let's go to a curiosity. And that is, why does a donkey appear in some cases and a mule in others? Some people might say, I have a mule and was told it's a mule, but why isn't it a donkey? Biblical sources like Isaiah 1:3 more and the Apocrypha identify the donkey, onos, as the second animal with the ox. Popular and medieval iconography experienced a variation, occasionally introducing the mule. So do we have concrete sources that the animal fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy is the donkey, asinus in Latin, the same one that carries Mary to Bethlehem and on the flight from Egypt? Someone might wonder, why does the mule appear? Well, the appearance of the mule, the substitution of the mule, which is mulus for the donkey, was an artistic phenomenon. That's why we've talked about the iconography that can be seen in some representations from the early medieval period. This variation wasn't due to a change in theology. So far, theology has only played a role because of linguistic ambiguity. The clear difference between donkey and mule faded in popular Latin and vernaculars, so people use the same terms for both animals. How about carrying loads? As a strong pack animal, the mule may have been depicted by artists as the Holy Family's transportation. Although the donkey was the animal traditionally associated with humility, the mule has never had the same theological or historical significance as the donkey. In the nativity scene, it remains a minor folkloric variant of the tradition. And here I would add something, which is, do you know what was depicted in the parts of Jesus, like in the churches? They appear in different scenes. Mary goes to Egypt, the flight to Egypt, and the nativity are each scenes. Surely the mule appears to differentiate from when Mary goes on the flight to Egypt, where she goes with a donkey or a barrow. Putting a donkey again could cause confusion, so of course by putting another animal, there's a difference between one event and the other that can be seen visually. Would it be the same or connected? I mention this because it's studied in art history, and that's likely the reason. And here I brought you something just out of curiosity. These are the earliest depictions of the ox and donkey in the nativity scene, dating from 330-350 AD. AD, here are the first representations. It's clear that from Jesus' death to their depiction, it's already the 4th century. That is to say, this has been constructed theologically over time. So, the sarcophagus of Bolygegniak is considered one of the oldest preserved nativity scenes. The account shows baby Jesus wrapped and lying in the manger, with an ox and a donkey leaning over him, warming him with their breath and worshipping him. And so I have simply brought Jacob a series of images for you to see on the screen, just out of curiosity. That is to say, don't worry about this, you can see it. This is the oldest one from the 4th century we've discussed. You can proceed if you wish. Here, for the people, are the 2 animals in a larger view. This is our oldest one. Let's take a look. I've prepared some examples for you. Here we have another one, which is a relief from a 4th century sarcophagus from the catacomb of San Giovanni. It's in Italy, and here again we see the 2 animals. From the 4th century onward, there are many images and sarcophagi. Here's another from the 4th century, the Basilica of San Ambrosio in Milan. Again, we have the 2 animals, exactly like the one from Arequipa that I showed at the beginning. And here we have the 4th century from the cathedral in Italy. Again, the 4th century. That is to say, as we can see, starting from the 4th century, many representations proliferated and appeared. And here we have another curiosity. Is this the first living nativity scene? St. Francis of Assisi created the first living nativity scene on Christmas 1223 in Greccio, Rieti Valley, Italy. St. Francis, who had visited the Holy Land and Bethlehem, wanted to recreate the scene of the birth of Jesus with the greatest simplicity possible, so that the people could visualize the poverty in which the Son of God came into the world. The date is Christmas Eve, 1223, in a natural cave near the Hermitage in Greccio. And the purpose was to avoid the pomp and splendor of the celebration of the time and to focus on the humility of the incarnation. St. Francis wanted people to witness the harsh reality of the birth themselves, and that's the quote I provided. The reenactment did not include, as it does now, real actors. In other words, there were no actors to portray the Holy Family, but instead focused on the elements of the stable that are mentioned. From the Rieti Valley, in the valley of El Valle, from in the Rieti Valley, the valley of in the Rieti Valley, in the Rieti Valley. Ratzinger in 2012, he explained the distinction between the biblical basis and devotional tradition, which was formalized and clarified in contemporary times by Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. Joseph Ratzinger, reaffirming the role of the donkey, confirms that its presence is due to the rich background of the tradition of Isaiah's prophecy. Its presence is due to the prophetic reading of Isaiah, or is it the Church Fathers' application? Is it Ratzinger who says it's a donkey, not a mule? He is not against people putting a mule, but it is Ratzinger himself, the Pope, who reaffirms that it is a donkey. And this is in the prologue of the infancy from the book Jesus of Nazareth by Ratzinger. That is to say, we can see clearly, this is clear, and with this we have finished. That it is a donkey, that is an ox, and a donkey, as it is in the prophet Isaiah. So that's why it's the explanation of the mule that we've seen over time. So all of this is the explanation of the origin of the animals, of the fish.
Basically, are you telling me that the people who make a nativity scene nowadays do it? Because at the time, the authors of these gospels, whether him or the apocryphal ones, basically misunderstood Hebrew. And from there, it evolved. And for artistic reasons, they started to portray it in a certain way. And well, it got out of control. And today, everyone who celebrates that holiday puts these animals to represent a mistake in the understanding of Hebrew. That's basically it.
Well, we could explain it by saying that in the New Testament, there's nothing. I mean, when we've read the New Testament, there's nothing else. Matthew doesn't even mention the manger, only Luke does. But of course, what they're trying to do here is reinterpret the Septuagint, which is in Greek, because its basis, the basis of the New Testament, is not the Masoretic text, it's the Greek text. You'll notice a text that reads like a prophecy, saying he knew in the past tense, as if it was a unique event, making you wonder when it happened, in a manger. So they relate the manger to what appears in the New Testament. And from there are two animals. So are they going to include those two animals that aren't in the New Testament? So what was said by Isaiah and Habakkuk is fulfilled. There are two living beings that also worship the Lord. So two animals that are two living beings, an ox and a donkey. So they place them next to Jesus. Then over time, we've seen that with language, it has been changing. The donkey became a mule. So in the end, there has been debate about whether it's a mule or a donkey. The Pope made it clear it's not a donkey, as stated in the book of Isaiah. So you need to refer to Isaiah. And yes, indeed, the traditions were built with the interpretation of the Christian homeland. And they are formalized in the Pseudo-Matthew, and with that comes the tradition. Many of the traditions that Catholicism has come from apocryphal sources, that is Pseudo-Matthew. The Proto-Evangelium of James, clearly, that is, they are
cousins.
They're either Jesus' brothers or cousins, as referenced in the Proto-Evangelium of James.
Something that's a curious fact about the manger is that the word manger itself, fatne, is also somewhat ambiguous. I know this shows up with Homer, but in the Christian tradition, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's Justin Martyr who says it's a cave. So also, for example, there are Christian groups today who say no, that it's a sukkah. A sukkah is like a hut. Yes, so they try to reclaim what the Christian tradition explained as a cave. And when they represent it, then was it a stable? In fact, I was recently with someone who is an expert and is also a tour guide on these topics. He told me in Jerusalem that we stopped at a place called Han, in Arabic, Han. It's like a place where when you traveled long distances, everyone would stop at the Han, tie up their donkeys or animals below, and go upstairs to sleep. So, Han, you could say, well, a parking lot, maybe it was a similar situation. The divergence in the Christian tradition about it being a cave is similar to differences about the Nativity, which you have explained on your channel, which I'll leave in the description, Magisterium Levi, which you can also watch in collaboration. That we are, and between Matthew 2:1 and Luke 2:1, on one hand, Jesus is born in Bethlehem, supposedly during the days of King Herodes in Matthew, but in Luke, it's during the census of Quirinius. But by this time, Herodes had already died, and Herodes dies. In 4 before Common Era, the census is in 6 Common Era. That is to say, Jesus was not born in year 0, either here or there, maybe before Herodes, but it's that kind of curiosity. And well, I don't know if you have anything else to add. Well, something else to add as well. The reason I said supposedly born in Bethlehem is because there is practically a consensus, and you might correct me, that Jesus is from Nazareth, not from Bethlehem. But the evangelists, as evangelists do, try to make Jesus fulfill prophecies. So they write, well, it was written in Micah about Bethlehem, so let's make it Bethlehem, or as you explained it, Isaiah talks about a manger or crib, like this word, so we relate it in the Greek reading. So Jesus has to fulfill Isaiah, and he also has to fulfill Habakkuk, and it's like he fulfilled prophecies after the fact, the ones the evangelist wants him to fulfill. The event isn't truly historical in that sense either.
Notice that Matthew says he came out of the grotto when discussing the shroud, and St. Francis is always depicted in a cave, so we can clearly see what happens with the shroud. Matthew says he entered a stable and placed the child in a manger. So we have to keep in mind that Christian traditions are often based on apocryphal texts. This is the reality. I mean, Jesus had brothers, so if you look at the apocryphal text, well, it shows up, disappears, right? Yes, because you must uphold the dogma that Mary is always a virgin, so that's how it is. Now, what you're telling me, yes, indeed, Herod is the Great. He dies in the year 4 before Christ and supposedly carries out a persecution. Children born then were ages 0 to 2. So when was Jesus born? Jesus was likely born between 4 before Christ before Herod died, since Herod is alive in Matthew's account. Up to 6 before Christ, since it's a 2-year window. So between 4 before Christ and 6 before Christ, Jesus is born. Then Luke asks when Jesus is born. The census of Quirinius. The census of Quirinius is in the year 6 AD, which means there could even be up to a 10-year difference. The census of Quirinius sparked a revolt by Judas the Galilean and Zadok the Pharisee. This was a very important event. That is, people recognize it, and yet what we see is that the accounts of Matthew and Luke are incompatible. But that's because Matthew doesn't want to teach you something historical. He wants to tell you that Jesus is the new Moses. So there's a massacre of the firstborn, they go to Egypt, then Jesus spends 40 days in the desert with Satan, and he responds to Satan like Moses. That is, this isn't a theological account. Luke is actually trying to make a more historical account. However, Matthew is a degas, as they say, as we saw in another video, while they linked Jesus to David there. Here he wants to show him as Moses. There's supposedly a massacre of the firstborn in Egypt, but nothing about it is real or historical. No massacre, nothing at all. That is, the story that Lucas wants to tell us is the historical one. They supposedly moved due to a census that never existed, as there was no tribal or universal census in Rome. There is no text on this, but they do say they moved to be registered for the census. Was Rome where you lived? Just like it's done today, it's not historical. Still, Lucas wants to show a prophecy will be fulfilled, a prophecy that mentions Assyrians and more. I don't think that's from Jesus' time. They reinterpret the Old Testament like they did with Judas and Ahithophel. That is to say, there are always reinterpretations. Reinterpretations with Moses, Jesus is the new Moses. In other words, there is always a reinterpretation of the Old Testament so that Jesus relives the events and deeds of the past. Moses spent 40 days in the wilderness. I also spent 40 days. That is, we will see that even when Moses and Elijah appear as well. If anyone ever wants to see the parallels, just look at when Moses goes up the mountain and you'll see that the stories are similar. And that's because they're using, it's like Jesus has to relive all the events or happenings from the past. And where those in the past supposedly failed, he is going to fulfill them. David fails, Jesus doesn't. Moses fails, Jesus doesn't. He's surpassing all the characters from the Old Testament to show you that he is the Messiah. That's the narrative and theological account it aims to explain. Matthew and Luke both use numbers. If someone reads the genealogy, they should know it's about numbers. Everything is structured numerically. There are 70 generations with Enoch as the 7th. In the book of Enoch, there's a prophecy that after 70 generations, judgment would come. And who is the 70th generation? Jesus fulfilling a prophecy of Enoch, and that's why there's 7, which is Enoch. And from Enoch to Jesus, there are 7. David and Abraham appear in numbers that are multiples of 7, 77, 77, 56, 42. Everything is organized so that even with gematria, connecting to Jesus is clear. We've seen in Matthew, there are 14 generations between Jesus and David, and the gematria of David is 14. Nadal, Abba Philadal, 4 plus 6 plus 4 equals 14. And everything is like that. Everything is connected or reinterpreted, so Jesus fulfills and links numerically, narratively, and theologically with Old Testament narrative schemes, including numerical ones.
Very interesting. It's ironic that everything that Christianity at the time fought against heretics and apocryphal texts only for them to end up prevailing in Christian culture. There's a lot to discuss about them. Thanks for joining us, Luis, from the Magisterium Levi channel. I'll also link a video below on Judas, which included Ariel from the Judas the Historia channel. And well, from many other videos we've made, we send you a warm greeting. Have a great day.